My name is Wright. I am the voice of reason. I speak for the Last Crusade.
To recover the church in the world requires the truth. Nothing else will save us. All other institutions on earth are earthly. Only the church is immortal, eternal, divine, and aims at something beyond the walls of the world. The church can be, and has been, corrupted and her spirit slain. The church can be, and has been, revived from the dead. Several times in ages past she has returned to life. The church knows the secret of resurrection. No worldly power can say the same. We can put no faith in the promises of worldly powers, first, because they are faithless, second, because they are worldly, and finally, because they are powerless. They are powerless because worldly things are inevitably corrupt, and corruption cannot cure corruption. The leprous doctor cannot cure you of leprosy. All hope in the worldly powers is vanity, because these powers, being worldly, have no love in them. And without love there is no beauty, no truth, no virtue. Unfortunately, the enemy has infiltrated the church. We live in the era of the silent congregation. The world has made the church worldly. And we, the faithful, we faithlessly stood by silently and let that happen. Every few generations, the church must expel from our leadership and from our fellowship any enemies among us who will not repent and convert. The time for excommunication has come again. No Christian can call a Christian his brother who advocates for the infanticide of the unborn, or for the mutilation and castration of children, or who will not say, God created man in his own image, in the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. The long, slow, painful, and tragic process of cleansing must begin again, as it has so many times before. This is not merely a protracted and painful battle in the Last Crusade. This is the last and also the everlasting battle. There is no end to it, no more than there is an end to the wash of the wave against the sea cliff. The most that can be hoped is to erect a wall of stones to slow the erosion. We must be that wall. Our hearts must be firm as rock, unflinching and unyielding in faith. All these previous orations have examined the enemy closely. Here we must turn a weary eye once more upon the marred, formless, and gorgon visage of the foe, to identify his strategy and to emplace our defenses. This generation has a secular cult, a worship of worldly powers in the place of the God of Abraham. The cross and the Ten Commandments have been pulled down from public places, and prayer is forbidden in schools. In its place, the enemy has reared up an idol, as vast and dark and false as any idol of the beast mentioned in the vision of the Apocalypse of St. John. This beast is the culmination and sublimation of all previous heresies, of all ages past, folded into one. In a very real sense, worship of worldly powers is the church of Antichrist. The worldly powers wage revolt against civilization. These are not the poor and dispossessed who are rising up to overthrow a tyrant. These are the elite and overprivileged who are trampling the poor in order to establish a tyrant. The worldly powers will wage jihad, a hellish holy war, against all culture, laws, traditions, and history of the West, including, with an insolent indifference to truth and logic, waging war against the very things in whose names they wage war, namely, dignity, equality, liberty, brotherhood. But the worldly powers seek all these things by the dull and deceptive marsh light of their own vain and vapid imaginings, for they shun the light of truth. Hence what results is profoundly vulgar, unjust, despotic, and pusillanimous. The gulp of this revolt of the world's elite is familiar: anarchy, riot, plunder, and mutiny against heavenly principles and against human law. The plunder in this case is not only wealth and power in the secular sphere, but the dignity and glory of all the imponderables they have not earned. They crave the palm of martyrdom without the indignity of suffering, the monument of heroism without the work of war, the laurels of poets for gargling gibberish, the halo of sainthood for abominations and sins, and badges of courage for being jejune, conformist, and safe. However, this is the first revolution in modern times waged by the rich and powerful to dispossess the poor and weak. In the name of diversity, equality, and inclusion, the institutions of the West are being overthrown, but not all institutions, not their institutions, only ours. The groves of academia are untouched. Thousands of illegal aliens are not flooding into Yale. But the high schools in the suburbs now must allow boys in drag into your daughter's locker rooms and on their sports teams. The law courts and halls of power are untouched. They hold the same old men of the same old party who supported Jim Crow back in the day. But the ghettos where the poor are gathered now have their police force defunded. The rich and mighty still have their many wives and many divorces. Their families are untouched. But mothers on welfare are bribed not to marry the fathers of their children, so that gangland will raise the little delinquents instead. Family life among the poor is nearly eradicated. Among the poor, the aborted outnumber the born, and bastards outnumber children born in wedlock. This revolution is meant to establish, not to overthrow, a despotic hierarchy, a caste system. Only the strongholds of the poor and meek are besieged. And the foremost institution that ever was the help and support of the poor, the church, is besieged foremost. The dogmas of this worldly revolt are familiar, namely that the truth is not absolute, that reality is not objective, reason is not trustworthy, beauty has no standards, man is a mere beast possessed neither of honor nor dignity nor natural rights. Life is a flux of meaningless events without justice, without love, without fellowship, patriotism, or point, and most of all, without God. Neither virginity nor matrimony is sacred, oaths are not sacred, truth is not sacred, human life is not sacred, nothing is sacred. Like the Gnostics of old, the worldly powers hold the cosmos to be divided between the elect, who are pure, and the reprobate, who are damned. Their purity flows from an ineffable inner truth, one to which they alone are enlightened, or woke. The elect are beyond criticism, and the reprobate are beyond salvation. As nihilists, the worldly powers hold that there is no truth. The fact that Gnosticism and nihilism are mutually exclusive and logically incompatible detours none of them. For no dogma is open to question, since to question marks the questioner as reprobate, hence one too benighted to be heard or to be answered. Instead of the truth, which they despise, the worldly powers have the narrative, which folds and twists like a world-girdling serpent, shaped ever to their needs of the moment. Why this serpent is so seductive has been said many times, but it bears repeating here. Diversity, toleration, victimhood, and political correctness are the four horsemen of falsehood. First, the appeal to diversity is a slothful and lazy way to seem enlightened, but without the hard work of showing any real love or charity to any real fellow man. Second, the appeal to toleration is a slothful and lazy way to excuse one's own sins, for none can condemn fornication once all applaud sodomy. Third, the appeal to victimhood is a slothful and lazy way to excuse ingratitude, and hence excuse the duties of piety and patriotism which accompany gratitude toward father or toward nation. Once ingratitude is the norm, no man will be criticized for his selfishness, his greed, or his indifference to the poor. Ingratitude excuses all failures. Ingratitude shifts all blame to the nearest convenient scapegoat, which the lazy imagination can invent for any reason to defame. Ingratitude also unleashes the beast of hate from its iron kennels in hell. Finally, political correctness is a lazy and quick way to escape from the work of thought, debate, and civilized discourse. Merely redefine any word to the opposite of its real meaning, and one can spew endless nonsense without any fear of contradiction. And one can spew endless contradictions without any fear that any man will call it nonsense. Call the free market capitalism, and call honest work wage slavery, and voila! All argument is mute. Call any disagreement racist and fascist, and you never need to stir a tongue, or pen, or a single brain cell ever again to answer any questions. Ignore all questions. Destroy all questioners. Diversity, toleration, victimhood, and political correctness are the four horsemen of falsehood together, and they have a strange effect on the unwary. They act to summon a vision of the shining towers of Utopia rising on the pink clouds of a new dawn, where unicorns dance and rainbows sing. Imagine there's no heaven. It is not hard to do. Imagine no hell, no possessions, no nations, nothing to kill nor die for. Imagine no families, no individuality, both sexes as one bisexual unisex drone creature, bald and gray with dead eyes. Imagine all the people living for their own daily physical gratifications, living together as one, amid the universal peace and happiness of a worldwide graveyard of perfect silence. This utopian vision is a lazy way to substitute emotion for thought, to disguise selfishness, and to mask wickedness, and to excuse the reckless defamation of all that is bright and good, civilized and decent. Cloaked and garbed as the righteous fury of the morally supreme, hatred is let loose upon the world to work its will, and I mean pure hatred, hatred without limit, the hatred of hell which has neither point nor purpose nor satiation. The utopian vision unleashes hate in the name of love. It unleashes moral degradation in the name of moral purity, unleashes falsehood in the name of enlightenment, unleashes perversion in the name of liberty, and in short, unleashes everything low in the name of everything high. This is what has entered the churches of the Christians, the temples of the Jews, and the hearts of all men of goodwill in the West. The question, then, is why this vision of utopia prospers when the more logical and healthier orthodox alternative, that is, Christianity and all the Western tradition, is despised and silenced. Who would prefer a cult that offers total condemnation with no forgiveness, promises utopia on earth but only a future that never comes, and promises a doctrine of universal original sin but no doctrine of universal atonement and forgiveness? It is not preferred because sober debate confirms it. No debate, no argument is ever made to support this utopia. No arguments are made because no one can make such an argument. One cannot argue that a self-contradictory mess is more true than a doctrine known to be self-consistent and sound. One cannot argue that a jejune, chaotic, hypocritical, and half-witted heresy is more ancient, coherent, authentic, and sober than the ancestral doctrines tested by millenniums and affirmed by the wisest mind of all generations. Utopia is preferred for the reason endlessly repeated here, laziness and sloth. This hellish idiocy has prevailed, and is even now consuming the church like a galloping leprosy, not just because of the sloth of its advocates, but also because of the sloth of its opponents, you and me. The advocates of Antichrist betray Christ because this is the easier way to gain their goals without embracing the difficult paths of martyrdom, heroism, genius, saintliness, or self-reliance. Their way demands not even the modest inconvenience required by normal levels of decency, courtesy, civic virtue, or modesty. Our allies and leaders, allegedly the pastors of Christ, do not resist the blind servants of Antichrist because this is the easier way. Resistance might lead to inconvenience. Now the church must be the standard-bearer and permanent institution devoted to the reformation of civilization in all the ways outlined in these prior orations. To reform or raise the media, especially the news media, the tech giants, the popular entertainment, the political powers, and the corporate culture of the academic world, and indeed the intellectual life of civilization. This requires the same type of networked organization in which the enemy excels: boycotts, lobbyists, pressure groups, think tanks, and dedicated cadres of individuals assigned to the long-term goals of outweighting the lifespans of professorships with tenures and judgeships with lifelong terms of office, to control the candidacy of the rising generation and exclude the faithless and unpatriotic, weak, impure, and criminal who control the pool of candidates now. The only institution with the staying power to organize over the long term and across all nations, as she did since the time of Constantinople, is the Church. In Roman times, without the slightest hint of violence or even of disobedience to the imperial authority, the Church exerted a continuous and silent pressure against such abominations as gladiatorial games, slavery, pederasty, sodomy. She must do so again in these modern times against these same abominations come again, some in their old masks, as sodomy and pederasty, and some in new, as slavery is now called human trafficking and disguised as an immigration reform issue. For the church to take on this role requires first the reform of the church and of all denominations, which is a long-term and difficult process, perhaps impossible. The enemy knows and has always known that the church is the main stronghold against him and against his minions and thralls. The enemy has taken great efforts to divide the church and corrupt her leadership. Reunification of the church is more feasible now than in any generation past, now that the number of martyrs slain for Christ's sake exceed those in any time in the past, including the bloodiest days of Nero. But the reunion of the leadership of a visible church is not needed now. What is needed is the is the love between all the brethren of all denominations. What is needed is to work in a common purpose to save all denominations from a common degradation and destruction. The church must expel the anti-church from her midst. And this return to Christ is only the first step. Once the church resumes her ancient role as the church militant, taking up sword and shield and donning all the armor of virtue, and raising aloft the banner in whose sign we conquer, the question then is where to go and what method of combat to employ. The early church clasped hands in prayer and raised no fist in violence. The price was high and bloody and painful, but the victory was certain. Violent insurrection is justified, seemingly inevitable, now that the enemy has lightly tossed away the last fig leaf of lawful conduct and stolen the government by naked fraud. Nonetheless, violent insurrection is not feasible. A second civil war in the United States would be far worse than the first. The men of the war between the states, those many years ago, were men of honor, and could win without vaunting and surrender without dishonor. That the nation was reforged back into one whole was a miracle. The scars remain and always will, and lingering resentment will always be found to stoke the ancient division back into flame. But nonetheless, those were civilized men. Peace was possible after war, for them. This generation is addicted to dishonesty, to cowardice, and to vice. There are no men of honor, no men who fear God among the worldly powers. No word of treaty could be trusted, no peace could hold. Breaking the nation now will simply hand the world to China, whose cruel hegemony will last beyond all foretelling. Civil war in America will lead to clear disaster and to the downfall, not of America only, but of all Western nations. The enemy has a clear and simple plan: to continue to provoke patriots in the name of public safety, or in the name of protecting democracy, or in the name of helping transgender queer black men, women, or for fighting global warming, cooling, or whatever other idiotic bafflegab gushes from their teeth. The excuse does not matter. The traitors will provoke the patriots until the patriots take up arms, whereupon public safety will demand the confiscation of all guns, the registration of all citizens, total surveillance of all civilians at all times, and the whole apparatus of secret police, anonymous accusations, arrests and executions without trial, mass expropriations and deportations to penal camps, and everything the 20th century taught mankind how to do. And the gates of hell will open. It should be noted that the enemy does not necessarily know nor care what will come once the shooting starts. Whether they think they will survive the wreckage of the West and rule the ruins, or whether it will come as a surprise to them when they are slain in the chaos, or during the ascendancy of whatever power steps into the vacuum thus created, is of no matter. For our part, we must tolerate the impositions and resist with all legal methods remaining, if any. Taking up arms should be eschewed until the actual gun confiscation begins. Other acts of civil disobedience, such as by going to church on Sunday in open defiance of the laws forbidding this, or preaching against homosexuality, are not only permitted but wise. How and where and when each man decides to break the law, let him and his pastor decide. But let it be done deliberately, by planning as part of an overall strategy, not done haphazardly, not hastily, and not at the prompting of passion. Count the cost before you challenge the law. In all respects, this is a spiritual war. The undisguised love of the enemy for all things miserable, unjust, abhorrent, and ungodly has never been more clear. As said above, for our part, we must blacken the name of Utopia, rob the lazy imagination of glory, and give it no more courtesy of a hearing. The vision of all men living as gender-free egalitarian serfs, toiling under the lash of enlightened, self-anointed, benevolent despots, is a vision of the fiery lake of sulfur, wherein fallen angels and damned souls scream and wail and mutter and burn. A better vision awaits us, a true vision. To win the hearts and souls in the arguments, we must propound the great and dramatic story of man and win the world, which only the West understands and loves. The young need to be enchanted, lured, and mesmerized by a finer vision than the story of victimhood. They need to be told about heroism. We must replace the narrative of victimhood with the narrative of that typically male heroic ideal, namely the self-made man. This vision must rule the intellectual life of the West. We must topple the fatuous towers of Utopia built on pink clouds of airy nonsense, and draw the eyes of men to the unpleasing truth that we live in the landscape of the Pilgrim's Progress, with the Slough of Despond at one hand and the Valley of the Shadow of Death at the other. And somewhere on the rocky road ahead, the great prince of this world, Lucifer, black and magnificent in his adamantium armor, sword burning in his hand, is waiting to defeat and enslave us, and we must fight him. To undermine the towers of Utopia, we must do all that Caesar promises to do and cannot perform. We must be the hope of the poor and the champion of the downtrodden. Again, if we do not have a compassionate plan for the hardship and sadness of the poorest and most ignorant of the inner-city mobs, all is lost. Against these humblest do the seeds of the word of Christ find the richest soil. Here, in the ghettos, saints are born. Here, saints are needed. We have to show these poor why freedom, including private charity, is better and more reliable than life on the vote plantation, with its crippling big government nanny state smothering all hope. Real reform we began to see in a small way in recent years. Politicians willing to break with the machine politics, free enterprise zones, support for black colleges rather than for black victim groups. The worldly powers reacted with insane hatred at these attempts, screaming like vampires repelled by a crucifix. The worldly powers openly broke the laws and defrauded the voters in order to seize the reins of government once more. This was not an overreaction by the evildoers. They see their end is near. The slightest bit of honest charity and aid given to the poor threatened to rob the vampires of their stranglehold over the lifeblood of a nation, now and forever. No law need change for the culture of the inner city to change, and no institution save the church stands the smallest chance of spearheading such a change. Or, rather, laws are downstream of culture. Once the culture is Christian, the anti-Christian laws or customs will give way. Alas, I doubt me that the current church can face the task. We must set our holy places in order first and seek the face of the Lord. If the rumors of cooperation between the traditionally black Baptist denominations and the machine politics of the inner city are true, those congregations must rise up against the wolves disguised as shepherds among them. They must anoint truly God-fearing men, courageous, humble, just, and pure in faith, to lead them in their stead. I call it a rumor because it would be untoward of me to criticize the denomination of which I am not a member. Let each flock know and bind up its own wounds, and expel the Judas at their supper table. For myself, I can comment with all due humility only on the Roman Catholic Church, whose variance, vagrancy, neglect, and satanic indifference to the laws of God and the laws of nature, all my co-religionists know all too well, or at least have heard ugly rumors. Pederasts among the priesthood and idols in the Vatican should either be burned or thrown into the Tiber with a curse. The shameful cowardice with which American bishops allowed our masses from Easter to Christmas to be closed, while the brethren in the Far East are being martyred for the least crumb of the Eucharist, cries out like the blood of Abel in the earth. Despite this, no layman is excused from his obedience to the pastors and fathers put over us. Once the church is set in order, we can begin to dream of rebuilding a truly Christian society. Let me close with words wiser than mine. This comes from the pen of C.S. Lewis. I've taken the liberty of substituting American words for his English words, for clarity's sake. The New Testament, without going into details, gives us a pretty clear hint of what a fully Christian society would be like. Perhaps it gives us more than we can take. It tells us that there are to be no passengers or parasites. If a man does not work, he ought not eat. Everyone is to work with his own hands, and what is more, everyone's work is to produce something good. There will be no more manufacture of silly luxuries and then of sillier advertisements to persuade us to buy them. There is to be no stylishness nor snobbery, no putting on airs. To that extent, a Christian society would be what we now call leftist or progressive. On the other hand, it is always insisting on obedience and outward marks of respect. from all of us to properly appointed magistrates, from children to parents, and, I'm afraid this is going to be very unpopular, from wives to husbands. Thirdly, it is to be a cheerful society, full of singing and rejoicing. And regarding worry or anxiety as wrong. Courtesy is one of the Christian virtues, and the New Testament hates what it calls busybodies. If there were such a society in existence, you or I visited it, I think we should come away with a curious impression. We should feel that its economic life was rather very socialistic, and in that sense progressive. But its family life and its code of manners were rather old-fashioned, perhaps even ceremonious and aristocratic. Each of us would like some bits of it, but I'm afraid very few of us would like the whole thing. This was from C.S. Lewis. I end with this question. How shall we reform the Church? How shall we quell the disunity of the denominations and act as one against our common foes? How shall we begin the great work of resurrecting Christendom and making the West Christian once again? We must begin with ourselves in prayer and fasting. This ends my final oration and is the last word in this series. I have no more to say on the topic of the Last Crusade. The time has come to take the vow, don the cross of red, and march to war. It has been an honor to be allowed to offer these thoughts and exhortations. Let not your sword sleep in your scabbard, my brothers. The time is at hand, and Godspeed.